So, the last location that we're going to talk about in Manifest Destiny is New Mexico and California. Now, native peoples had lived in New Mexico for thousands of years. Spanish conquistadors began exploring there in the late 1500s. When Mexico wins its independence, it obviously inherits New Mexico from Spain. Except they had very little control over New Mexico. It was a long ways from Mexico City, so it was difficult to keep control over. Now, when the Spanish had controlled it, they had tried to keep the Americans away, in particular from Santa Fe, fearing that we would want to take over the place. I can't imagine why they'd think that. But the Mexican government changed that policy, hoping to boost their economy. So William Becknell, in 1821, becomes the first American trader to reach Santa Fe. He sold his merchandise he bought in Santa Fe, or that he found that he could sell his merchandise for many times what he would have received in St. Louis. It was the only trade, he was the only one in town. He was the only business in town. Well, quickly Santa Fe becomes a busy trade route for hundreds of wagons, and it was used until the railroad appears in 1880. So as trade with New Mexico increased, as you can guess, more and more Americans began settling in this area. You could call it manifest destiny. You could call it good business practices. That's what William Becknell did. He knew that he could make a lot of money in Santa Fe. He went that way. At the same time, Americans are eyeing another prize, the Mexican territory of California, which would provide that access all the way to the Pacific. Now, California had a very rich Spanish culture. Spanish explorers and missionaries had been the first Europeans to settle in California. And in the 1760s, we see the mission system being built. It extends eventually from San Diego to San Francisco. The mission system was a key part of Spain's plan to colonize California. They wanted to convert Native Americans to Christians. And so by 1820, there were 21 missions dotted in California. And there was roughly 20,000 Americans living in California. Well, after Mexico gains its independence, California became obviously a state in New Mexico, or in the new Mexican nation, and they abolished the mission system. The government gave some land to the Native Americans, kind of similar to reservations, and sold the rest. Well, the Mexican settlers persuaded these Native Americans to work their lands for food and shelter. It would have looked something very similar to plantations. Well, Americans were intrigued by California and this system. Americans had been visiting California for years. The Mexican authorities had always welcomed Americans to California. Many of the Americans were agents. They worked for shipping companies. They were fur traders. They were merchants from New Mexico. All of this builds the economy of California, which then helps the economy of Mexico. Well, in the 1840s, families start to arrive to California. And part of this was based upon manifest destiny, but part of it was American travelers wrote glowing reports of California. For instance, John C. Fremont, who was an explorer, wrote of the region's mild climate, the scenic beauty, and the abundant resources. Jedediah Smith, who was a fur trapper, in the 1820s had visited San Gabriel Mission just outside of Los Angeles, and he described these large farming and grazing establishments. great glowing reports that wanted to bring Americans in. But by 1845, the American population in California was only about 700, so still very, very small by 1840. But Americans had begun the talk about adding California to the nation. Think of the advantage of extending the United States territory all the way to the Pacific. The nation would be safely protected by the seas on both sides instead of having what could be potential enemies on 3 sides. It would only be on 2 sides. President Polk, in fact, twice offered to buy California and New Mexico, but Mexico refused. Before long, the United States would have to take both regions by force. He turned the word. After Mexico had refused to sell California and New Mexico the second time, President Polk put together this plot, and he wanted to make Mexico take the first military action. He had to figure out a way to make them attack. Then he could very easily get Congress to support an act of war. He could go in and kick Mexico's butt, and it was all because Mexico had punched first. Relations between the U.S. had been strained, and they got worse when the U.S. annexed Texas in 1845. Then there's this border dispute. The Rio Grande is what the United States said was the border, but Mexico said the Nueces River, 150 miles farther north. Now you should be looking at your handout on the war with Mexico, and you can see on there this disputed border area. Well, like many Americans, Polk saw California and New Mexico as rightfully belonging to the U.S. So he sent an agent into Mexico. $30 million for California and New Mexico. And Mexico needed to accept the Rio Grande as the Texas border. U.S. would then finish making all payments that Mexico owed American citizens. Sounds like a win-win situation. But Mexico refused, and in fact came back announcing their intentions to reclaim Texas for Mexico. Texas is part of Mexico. Well, General Zachary Taylor, who would become a president, marched his soldiers across this disputed border area. And April 24th, President Polk got what he wanted. Mexican soldiers attacked a small American force, and Congress agrees to a declaration of war against Mexico.